How did El Salvador become Trump's prison? In recent months, this small Central American country has come to international attention as the Trump administration has begun deporting migrants to its brutal high-security detention centres, often in direct contravention of US court orders. However, while this has led to growing outrage, the US administration has shown no sign of backing down. Indeed, it may even be planning to expand the scheme in worrying new ways. So, just how and why did this small country become a key part of one of the Trump presidency's most controversial policies? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security, and statehood. Immigration has become an increasingly significant issue in international relations. As growing numbers of people leave their countries due to conflict, environmental challenges, or persecution and search for a new life elsewhere, public opposition to immigration is growing. In response, many Western countries are now reaching agreements with other states to take in migrants. While supporters insist that these deals ease pressure on domestic institutions like healthcare and education, critics argue that they erode the right to asylum and expose migrants to danger by exporting them to countries with inadequate human rights protections. Perhaps the most controversial of these arrangements is the deal between the United States and the government of El Salvador. In 2025, the Trump administration struck a controversial agreement to deport migrants to Salvadoran high-security prisons, where critics argue they face appalling conditions and a threat to their lives. But just how did El Salvador become such a central part of Trump's immigration policies? The Republic of El Salvador is in Central America. At 21,000 square kilometres or 8,100 square miles, to its northwest is Guatemala and to its north and east is Honduras. To its south, it has a Pacific coastline. Spanish-speaking and predominantly Catholic Christian, its population currently stands at around 6.3 million. In 2023, its GDP per capita stood at around $5,400, making it a lower middle-income country. El Salvador's history stretches back at least 1,500 years. However, our story begins in the early 16th century when it was conquered by Spain. This lasted around 300 years, ending in the early 1800s when Spanish rule ceased in Central and South America. After a brief period within Mexico, El Salvador united with Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras and Nicaragua to form the Federal Republic of Central America in 1823. However, this federation collapsed a decade and a half later, and in 1841 El Salvador became an independent sovereign state. Although it briefly merged with Honduras and Guatemala to create the Greater Republic of Central America 50 years later in 1896, this lasted only 2 years, leaving El Salvador independent once more. In the years that followed, the country experienced significant political instability. This eventually led to a military coup in 1931 that marked the start of 5 decades of army rule. However, by the late 1970s, opposition to the ruling regime was growing, with more and more protests and strikes. As a result, in October 1979, the country's president was deposed by a faction of hardline military officers. Arguing that the country was on the brink of a Marxist revolution, they brutally cracked down on any and all dissent. This in turn plunged the country into a devastating civil war as US-backed government forces, supported by paramilitary death squads, took on the FMLN, a disparate group of left-wing organisations. In January 1992, the United Nations brokered a peace agreement ending the war. In addition to seeing the FMLN accepted as a legitimate political party, the military agreed to withdraw from politics. At the same time, judicial and electoral reform was accompanied by the creation of a new national police force. Likewise, various social and economic changes were introduced, including land reform. But while there were hopes that El Salvador could now put aside the legacy of the 13-year civil war and build a new future, the effects of the conflict were deep-rooted. All this would eventually come together in two interrelated ways. For a start, the country was deeply traumatised. The conflict, which had been marked by widespread human rights abuses, including state-sanctioned murder, torture, kidnappings and disappearances, had seen 80,000 people killed. Secondly, with more than 1 million people displaced, many had fled to the United States, establishing a large community in Los Angeles. There, many younger members of the community soon became caught up in the city's violent gang culture, eventually establishing their own Salvadoran groups, including one known as Mara Salvatrucha, also known in English as MS-13. At first, the problem was contained in the United States. For as long as the civil war continued in El Salvador, these gang members couldn't be sent back. However, once the conflict ended, deportations soon began. As a result, the vicious US gang culture was now overlaid on top of El Salvador's post-conflict trauma and poverty. By the turn of the millennium, the country faced a massive problem. Now numbering well over 50,000 members, the gangs had become increasingly dominant and were even willing to take on the police and other security forces directly. Meanwhile, efforts to deal with the issue were largely ineffective, and those that seemed to produce results were often short-lived. For example, in 2012, a truce was arranged that saw many public areas declared off-limits by the gangs in return for steps to reform the country's brutal prison system. But while death rates dropped dramatically, many opposed the deal, believing it gave the gangs a chance to regroup. As a result, the agreement collapsed in 2015, leading to another huge resurgence in violence. And it was this that sparked a new wave of migration to the United States. Indeed, by 2016, Salvadorans accounted for the largest national group granted asylum in the United States. And it was this, along with the arrival of other Central Americans, that fed the anti-immigration sentiment that would propel Donald Trump to the presidency in November that year. I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please consider giving the video a like and perhaps subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. It all really helps. Thanks so much, and now back to the video. While the first Trump administration soon began talks with El Salvador regarding immigration and ended the temporary protected status of Salvadorans in the United States, the critical moment came in May 2019 when the country elected a new president, Nayib Bukele. Seen as a young, up-and-coming reformer, just months later, the United States and El Salvador signed an asylum cooperation agreement. This enabled the United States to send non-Salvadoran asylum seekers to El Salvador. At the same time, the two countries also reached an enhanced border enforcement agreement. In return for more US funding and technical assistance, El Salvador agreed to step up its efforts to prevent irregular migration by strengthening border controls and expanding its security operations. But it wasn't just immigration where Bukele had an effect. Having promised to address the country's gang violence, he soon implemented various new policies. In addition to boosting security spending, he launched social programs in many deprived areas. All this appeared to bring impressive results. From a high of around 6,500 murders just a few years earlier, the number had dropped to just 1,100 by 2021. But despite this progress, things were about to change. On the 26th of March 2022, El Salvador experienced its deadliest day of violence since the end of the Civil War, when 62 people were killed in gang fighting. Responding quickly, Bukele imposed a state of emergency as police rounded up thousands of suspected gang members. However, despite significant criticism from human rights organisations, Bukele remained unrepentant. In the following years, he continued his war on the gangs, constructing South America's largest mega-prison, the Terrorist Confinement Centre, which was capable of holding 40,000 suspected gang members. Meanwhile, as the murder rate dropped dramatically and public security improved, Bukele's approval ratings shot up. Indeed, in the controversial presidential elections held in 2024, he secured over 80% of the vote. But while many outsiders condemned his draconian measures and raised concerns about his growing authoritarianism, Bukele embraced his reputation, even going as far as to call himself the world's coolest dictator. And it's against this backdrop that the current events are playing out. Having returned to power with another pledge to reduce immigration, the Trump administration quickly renewed its controversial partnership with El Salvador. Building on the earlier agreement, the new arrangement not only allowed the United States to deport Salvadoran nationals back to the country, but also to send non-Salvadoran migrants, including asylum seekers from across Latin America and beyond, to Salvadoran territory. However, while the Trump administration has presented the arrangement as a regional solution to irregular migration, critics viewed it as an unacceptable delegation of US asylum responsibilities to a country ill-equipped to handle them. With deportees confined in the terrorist detention centre, often in extremely cramped and dangerous conditions, human rights organisations have warned that the policy violates international norms on refugee protection. At the same time, they point out that it also risks placing vulnerable people in harm's way, many of whom have already fled violence and persecution. All this has been graphically highlighted by the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a Salvadoran with legal residence in the United States who was mistakenly deported to the country. Although the US government has since claimed that he's a member of MS-13, which has now been declared a terrorist organisation, the US Supreme Court nevertheless ordered the Trump administration to facilitate his return. But what makes all of this particularly significant is that at the heart of the policy lies the seemingly close relationship between Trump and Bukele. With both men presenting themselves as strongman leaders with a populist edge, they found much common ground. This relationship has also benefited them both. For Bukele, it means gaining international legitimacy as well as US support for his domestic security agenda. For Trump, the relationship is touted as proof that he's finding solutions to the immigration issue. All this came to international attention on the 14th of April when Bukele was welcomed to the White House. Lauding the Salvadoran as a tremendous leader and the coolest dictator in the world, Trump called his controversial anti-gang crackdown a model for the region. As for Garcia, both men were defiant. Despite the Supreme Court order, Trump refused to ask Bukele to return him. Meanwhile, Bukele insisted that he wouldn't smuggle a terrorist back to the United States. Moreover, Trump also made it clear that he even saw more room for cooperation. Indeed, in a particularly controversial moment caught on camera, he even proposed expanding deportations to perhaps include US citizens convicted of serious crimes, urging Bukele to construct more prisons. While deporting US nationals would seem to be a step too far, with legal experts questioning its constitutionality, the policy of sending migrants to high-security prisons raises some extremely important and uncomfortable broader questions. As many political leaders come under growing pressure to tackle migration, which has become a leading source of popular discontent in many countries, the developments in El Salvador have graphically illustrated that there are deeper and more worrying issues at play. As more countries investigate options for outsourcing the processing and housing of migrants, this raises profound legal, political, and moral questions, especially as many migrants are highly vulnerable refugees and asylum seekers who've done nothing wrong apart from trying to flee violence and persecution. In the meantime, the Trump administration shows no sign of backing down on its controversial policy. As a result, we may yet see thousands more people, many of whom have committed no crimes at all, sent to one of the toughest, most dangerous prisons in the world. I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.